We're at the Johnson Shaw Stereoscopic Museum in Meadville, Pennsylvania, which is on the site of, or in the building of, a former Christian Science church that would have been attended by Keystone View Company founder B. Lloyd Singley, and is now the museum dedicated to the history of the Keystone View Company, which was founded by B. Lloyd Singley. B. Lloyd Singley was a student at Allegheny College from 1886 to 1889, and he paid his tuition and his room and board primarily through selling for a stereoscopic company called Underwood & Underwood. And his commission on sales covered everything. He dropped out of Allegheny in 1889, and by 1892 founded the Keystone View Company, and actually used students at Allegheny College as the sales crew to go door to door selling the views that he had made. And most of the early views, the first series, numbers 1 through the first 20, 30, 40 or so, are primarily Meadville scenes. And so they were starting to take off locally and then much more regionally, and eventually Keystone View, which was founded on Lincoln Avenue here in Meadville, became a much bigger company on Market Street in Meadville, and eventually one of the largest employers of the area. And in doing so, bought out most of their competitors, Davis and Company and White and Company, Underwood and Underwood and so forth, and became the largest producer of stereoscopic materials in the country. From 1892 through the World War II era, doing very, very well. There's some world events where Keystone had their photographer there, and then the Associated Press bought the picture, or a newspaper purchased the picture, but it was the Keystone photographer that was on site. So those are probably sort of some of my favorite views, is some of the sort of world events that Keystone was sort of right there on the front lines of taking pictures. The other piece of it is for things like the Norden bomb sight, and we don't have one in our collection, but we get one semi-regularly on loan for display that was used to sight weapons that would be dropped from airplanes, helicopters, etc. during various wars. The lenses were all made by Keystone. It was a secret project that they were doing. A lot of the last impressive parts of our collection are images of Eisenhower as president and so forth from that 1950s era. And then by the 60s or so, it starts to decrease rapidly. During the late 40s, the television becomes in the early 50s, the television becomes much more of a staple in the American home. And I think as a result, you'll find that the non-electric, non-television, non-programming end of things in American pastimes starts to fade post-war. We're doing all right primarily because they partnered with the Mast Company, or were purchased by the Mast Company, which made vision equipment. And Mast was very interested in the Keystone vision equipment that was being produced around the war, slightly before, slightly after. And it became the Keystone Mast Corporation, which is actually still around. But Mast had more interest in the vision testing. When you think like in school or at the eye doctors, and they ask, is it better number 1 or is it better number 2? And to check what your prescription might be. a lot of that equipment is still Keystone View Company or Keystone Mast. They still have a website. You can still purchase vision testing materials. Some of the eye doctors around here still use, in some cases, 30 and 40-year-old Keystone Mast equipment. And they said it's because it does exactly what the newer one does, and it's sort of a built to last situation. But yes, they're still involved. I don't know how large of a market share they have on that end of things, but they are still up and running as a corporation for that purpose. And so, unfortunately, the stereography side, in terms of as education, recreation, what have you, was faded from importance on the company's portfolio. Mass starts to look at closing it down. But in fact, by the end of the 60s, the Keystone is completely out of Meadville, with the exception of items in storage. The building is leased to house what becomes the Meadville Unity Center, which is a Black community hub, if you will. And it's very much its presence as this on the stereography end of things in Meadville for certain, and nationally fades around that time. And eventually the negatives for most of the Keystone images, some of which are the only images of major parts of American or world history that exist, went to University of Southern California, Riverside. And the remainder of the inventory and some of the presses and the equipment to make them and so forth, sat in a building for many years until Lance and Eric Johnson, who are sons of the gentleman who worked for Keystone and was around when it was closing, and then also the grandson of Keystone employees, met the gentleman who had sort of inherited the buildings with the collection in them, and acquired the collection to make the museum here. And the museum's been open since the early 2000s. Well, Lance and Eric Johnson are the two who started the museum, and they acquired the collection from George Shaw, who had it stored after Keystone closed in a building, and I think he came across it more from acquiring the buildings that it was in. But the Johnsons had an interest in getting it from Mr. Shaw, largely because Lance and Eric's grandfather was the cabinet maker that made most of in many cases, some of the oak parts that might have gone into the stereoscopes themselves and so forth. They had several aunts and uncles that worked there. His father was in management there. So it very much was about 2 to 3 generations. In fact, they worked there briefly as kids at the very end, almost bred right into the family for multiple generations. And when they saw the opportunity to acquire, at that time, what was a collection in storage, in a dusty barn, they jumped at it to create the museum. It is open April through November. We do things here and partner with local organizations to offer field trips and things like that to students. Partner with the Historical Society on a summer camp every year to bring 8 to 12-year-olds through several historical sites, this being one of them, and where they make their own stereoscope card and learn about stereography and so forth. We're in sort of an exciting point right now. Lance is still very involved as a director emeritus and is one of our larger donors here. And we've started sort of from the outside in and repointed the building, working on different projects on the building itself, and then plan to, as part of that, get a little more excitement built up around what was one of Meadville's largest employers and manufacturers, and what was sort of a national treasure in the days before television. We're thrilled to be involved because it's an interesting and fun history that connects with arguably everyone's family history, or most everyone's family history. It's not something that's thought about a lot, but it's something that in sort of between 1900 and 1940 was probably in most, if not all, living rooms, as just sort of the regular thing. Just sort of stand there and go, wait a second, my grandparents probably were doing something very similar on a day like today, or my great-grandparents and so forth. So it very much allows you to sort of be one with your ancestors in that regard.